Ink stained her trembling fingers as she carved the treasonous words into the splintered oak paneling of the tavern. I hate the Alpha King. It was a death sentence written in a desperate, drunken haze, but the true terror didn't arrive the next morning. It came with the reply. Golda Hayes wiped the sweat from her brow, her hands rough and blistered from grinding willow bark and feverfew. The apothecary shop was suffocatingly hot, but the heat did nothing to thaw the ice settling in her chest. Outside her window, the cobblestone streets of Oakhaven were slick with autumn rain and crowded with the King's Guard. They were dragging carts loaded with winter grain, heavy sacks of flour, and dried meats. It was the third tithe this month. Golda, an unshifted wolf whose lineage was considered too weak to ever take on a furred form, belonged to the lowest rung of the kingdom's hierarchy. She survived by healing the sick and ignoring the politics of the Silvermane pack. But ignoring politics was no longer an option. Yesterday, a royal decree had conscripted her younger brother, Arthur, to the brutal border wars in the north. Today, the tax collectors had taken the last of their family's winter provisions. By nightfall, Golda had locked the apothecary and found herself seeking refuge in the dim, chaotic warmth of the Broken Boar. The tavern smelled overwhelmingly of stale ale, roasted mutton, and the unwashed bodies of desperate commoners. "You shouldn't be drinking that so fast, Jen," muttered Thomas, the burly tavern keeper, wiping down the scarred bar with a rag that had seen better days. "The King's patrols are crawling everywhere tonight. Lord Reginald has them on high alert. Let them patrol." Golda slurred slightly, slamming her wooden tankard onto the bar. The cheap ale burned her throat, but it successfully dulled the sharp edges of her panic. "Let them take the ale too. What does King Gideon care if we starve or freeze, as long as his stone castle stays warm?" Thomas shushed her frantically, his eyes darting toward the cloaked figures huddled in the corner booths. "Keep your voice down. You know the Alpha King's hearing extends far beyond the palace walls. They say he wanders the lower city in disguise." "Good," Golda hissed, stumbling backward from the bar. Her grief over Arthur had mutated into a blinding, reckless rage. "I hope he hears me." She staggered toward the back of the tavern, near the hearth where the shadows danced wildly against the wood-paneled walls. Pulling a piece of heavy charcoal from her satchel, a tool she usually used to mark medicine vials, she leaned against the wall. The rough oak scratched her cheek. With shaking, furious hands, she pressed the charcoal to the wood. "I hate the Alpha King." She stared at the jagged, ugly letters. They felt like a release, a tiny rebellion in a world that had stripped her of everything. Exhausted, she let the charcoal drop, pulled her cloak tight around her shoulders, and slipped out into the freezing rain. The next morning, the hangover hit Golda with the force of a warhammer. Her head pounded, but the physical pain was instantly overshadowed by a tidal wave of sobering panic. The memory of the tavern walls slammed into her mind. Treason. She had committed blatant, undeniable treason in a public place. King Gideon Sterling was not known for his mercy. He was a ruthless warrior who had conquered 3 neighboring territories by his 25th winter. He was a myth of violence and shadows, and she had just handed his guards the perfect reason to hang her in the town square. Forgetting her aching head and her empty stomach, Golda sprinted back to the Broken Boar. The tavern was empty save for Thomas, who was sweeping the floors. "Thomas, the back wall." She gasped, her lungs burning. "I need a rag. I need to scrub it off." "Scrub what off?" Thomas asked, leaning on his broom. Golda didn't answer. She rushed to the hearth, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She found the exact spot where she had stood the night before. The charcoal letters were still there, stark and condemning. "I hate the Alpha King." But as her eyes drifted downward, the breath completely vanished from her lungs. Directly beneath her messy, drunken scrawl, etched deeply into the wood with what looked like the tip of a razor-sharp hunting dagger, was a single word: "Dinner?" Beneath that, in elegant, terrifyingly precise handwriting, were the instructions. "The Glass Conservatory, midnight. Do not be late, Golda." Her knees buckled. He knew her name. The King had been here. As she stared at the writing, a distinct scent suddenly hit her senses, a scent that hadn't been there the night before. It was the smell of dark pine, ozone before a lightning storm, and raw, terrifying power. The unmistakable scent of an alpha. The midnight bell chimed from the great clock tower, each strike vibrating through the soles of Golda's worn leather boots. She stood before the towering iron gates of the royal estate, wearing her only decent dress, a faded forest green gown that she usually reserved for funerals. Tonight, she supposed, it was fitting. The royal guards did not stop her. In fact, they didn't even look at her. The heavy gates groaned open on their own, and a solitary servant holding a lantern wordlessly guided her through the winding, manicured gardens. The glass conservatory sat at the edge of the royal grounds, a magnificent dome of wrought iron and crystal, illuminated from within by hundreds of floating candles. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of blooming night jasmine and exotic orchids. In the center of the room sat a small, round table draped in dark velvet, laden with roasted pheasant, fresh breads, and jewel-toned fruits. And standing by the glass wall, looking out at the moonlit gardens, was King Gideon Sterling. He was far more imposing than the coins and tapestries depicted. Broad-shouldered and towering, he wore no crown, only a simple black tunic and dark leather trousers. His dark hair was brushed back, but a few unruly strands fell across a face that was brutally handsome, scarred across the jawline, and entirely unreadable. "You are exactly on time," Gideon said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that made the hair on Golda's arms stand up. It carried the undeniable cadence of an alpha's command, forcing her wolf instincts to submit, though she fought to keep her chin raised. "It is generally considered poor form to be late to one's own execution, Your Majesty," Golda replied, her voice trembling only slightly. Gideon turned to face her. His eyes were a striking, piercing amber. He studied her for a long, agonizing moment, taking in her faded dress, her defiant posture, and the pale terror in her cheeks. He didn't look angry. If anything, he looked incredibly tired. "If I intended to execute you, Golda Hayes, I would not have wasted a perfectly good pheasant to do it," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Sit." She obeyed, moving stiffly. Gideon sat opposite her, pouring a dark, rich wine into 2 silver goblets. "You were in the tavern," she said, unable to hold the question back any longer. "Last night. You saw me write it." "I did," Gideon confirmed, taking a slow sip of his wine. "I was sitting in the corner booth. You have terrible handwriting, by the way, and a remarkably foul mouth for an apothecary." Golda flushed, anger momentarily overriding her fear. "My brother was taken for your wars yesterday. My family's winter supply was taken for your larders this morning. Forgive me if my penmanship suffered under the weight of your tyranny." She squeezed her eyes shut the moment the words left her mouth, bracing for a blow or a barked order to the guards. Instead, she heard a soft, humorless chuckle. "My tyranny," Gideon repeated softly. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The oppressive weight of his aura receded slightly, replaced by a tense, focused energy. "Tell me, Golda, who collected your grain today?" "The Royal Guard," she snapped. "Under the banner of the crown. And who ordered the conscription of your brother?" "You did," she said, her voice breaking. "The decree had your seal." Gideon's amber eyes hardened, flashing with a dangerous, predatory light. "I have been on the northern front for 6 months. I returned to Oakhaven 3 days ago in secret. I have not issued a single tax decree, nor a conscription order, in over a year." Golda stared at him, her mind racing. "But the parchment." Lord Reginald read it himself in the square. It bore the crest of the Silvermane. Lord Reginald. Gideon spat the name as if it were poison. "My esteemed uncle, and the head of my council. The man who has been ruling as regent, in my absence." Gideon stood up and began to pace the length of the conservatory. "I returned to find my kingdom bleeding. The coffers are supposedly empty to fund the war, yet my soldiers are starving on the front lines. The commoners are being taxed into the dirt, and the blame is placed squarely on my shoulders. I spent last night in the lower city, listening to the whispers. Everyone hates the Alpha King. Reginald has orchestrated a masterpiece of treason. Why are you telling me this?" Golda whispered, her hands gripping the edges of the velvet tablecloth. "I am no one. I am an unshifted healer, because you are the only person I have encountered in 3 days who had the courage to tell the truth. Even if it was just to a wall," Gideon said. stopping behind her chair. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper near her ear. The scent of pine and ozone surrounded her, intoxicating and terrifying. My court is filled with vipers. I cannot trust my guards, my lords, or my advisors, but I know I can trust the fury of a sister trying to save her brother. What do you want from me? An alliance, Gideon stated plainly, moving back to his seat. You know the lower city. You know the merchants, the smugglers, the back alley routes. You know where Reginald's men are hoarding the stolen grain. I need eyes where my crown prevents me from looking. You want me to spy on the royal council? Golda asked, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. They will kill me. Lord Reginald's men are ruthless. They will try. Gideon corrected. But they will fail, because from tomorrow onward, you will not be a lowly apothecary. You will be under my direct, indisputable protection. He paused, his amber eyes locking onto hers with burning intensity. I will announce you to the court as my newly discovered mate. Golda's jaw dropped. Your mate? But we aren't. I'm human, well, unshifted. They will never believe it. They will believe it because I will make them believe it. Gideon said smoothly. It gives you full access to the castle. It gives you a reason to be at my side, and a reason to ask questions. Before Golda could formulate a response to the absolute insanity of his proposal, the heavy glass of the conservatory ceiling above them shattered. A shower of crystal shards rained down like deadly hail. Gideon moved with supernatural speed. In a blur of motion, he lunged across the table, tackling Golda to the stone floor just as a wicked, silver-tipped crossbow bolt buried itself into the velvet cushion of her chair. Stay down, Gideon roared, his canine teeth suddenly elongated, his eyes glowing a fierce, inhuman gold in the dim light. Above them, on the iron rafters, two figures dressed in black leather dropped into the room, drawing jagged, poison-laced blades. The dinner date had officially become a battlefield, and Golda realized with horrifying clarity that the Alpha King wasn't just paranoid. The crown was at war with itself, and she had just been dragged right into the center of the crossfire. Glass rained down like deadly diamonds, catching the moonlight before shattering against the stone floor. Gideon did not flinch. His transformation was instantaneous and terrifying, a blur of muscle, shifting bone, and dark fur. He caught the first assassin in midair, a sickening crunch echoing through the conservatory as the king's massive jaws snapped shut around the intruder's collarbone. Golda scrambled backward, her palms tearing on the jagged crystal shards littering the ground. She watched, paralyzed by a potent mixture of awe and horror, as Gideon dispatched the second assassin with a brutal, calculated strike. It was over in less than 10 seconds. The great Alpha King stood amidst the ruin of his dinner, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with an unholy, golden fire. He turned to her, wiping a smear of dark blood from his jaw. The feral intensity in his gaze slowly receded, replaced by the cold, calculating demeanor of a sovereign at war. Reginald is growing desperate, Gideon murmured, offering her a hand. His skin was scorching hot against hers. He knows I am back, and he knows I am looking into the ledgers. He sent them to kill you in your own home. Golda breathed, pulling herself up. If he is this bold, the entire palace guard could be compromised, which is precisely why you will not leave my sight, Gideon stated, leading her out of the ruined glass house and into the labyrinthine stone corridors of the royal keep. Tomorrow morning, the court convenes for the autumn tithe assessment. You will be by my side. Dawn broke over Oakhaven in a wash of bruised purple and gray. Golda found herself draped in heavy silk and dark velvet, garments procured by a terrified handmaiden who dared not ask why an unshifted apothecary was in the king's private chambers. When the heavy oaken doors of the great hall swung open, the silence that fell over the assembled nobility was deafening. Lord Reginald stood at the head of the council table. He was an older, distinguished wolf with silvering hair and a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. As Gideon strode into the room with Golda's hand resting firmly on his arm, the color drained entirely from Reginald's face. "Nephew," Reginald managed to say, his voice tight. We were told you would not return from the northern front until the winter solstice. Plans change, uncle," Gideon replied, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He guided Golda to the seat directly to his right, the seat of the Luna. I grew weary of the cold, and I was eager to introduce the court to my chosen mate. Murmurs erupted like a swarm of angry hornets. Noblewomen hid their gasps behind feathered fans, while the lords exchanged panicked, furious glances. Golda kept her chin high, channeling every ounce of her anger over her brother's conscription into a mask of regal indifference. "A mate?" Reginald challenged, stepping forward. "My king, this woman is. She has no scent of the wolf. She is unshifted, a commoner from the lower wards. She is my choice," Gideon snarled, releasing a fraction of his alpha aura. The oppressive weight hit the room like a physical blow, forcing several lesser lords to their knees. "And anyone who questions her place beside me will answer to my claws." The court bowed in trembling submission, but Golda caught the venomous glare Reginald shot her way. The game had officially begun. Under the guise of preparing for a royal bonding ceremony, Golda was granted unrestricted access to the castle grounds. She used her new authority to summon a private merchant from the lower city, a man she knew only by reputation, named Gregory Harrington. Gregory was a ruthless but pragmatic smuggler who handled the city's black market grain. Meeting him in the secluded royal gardens, Golda wasted no time. "I need to know where the royal tithes are going. Gregory, the king's army is starving, yet the carts leave the lower city every morning." Gregory Harrington shifted nervously, adjusting his silk collar. "You play a dangerous game, little apothecary. Lord Reginald pays very well for silence. The Alpha King pays with your life." Golda countered coldly, stepping closer. "Tell me where the grain is, or I will let the king assume you are the one stealing it." Gregory paled. "It never goes to the northern front," he whispered frantically. "Reginald redirects the caravans to the old iron mines in the eastern ridge. He is stockpiling food and weapons. He is building his own private army to overthrow the crown." Golda's words hung in the heavy silence of the king's chambers. She had relayed Gregory Harrington's confession verbatim, and with every syllable, Gideon's face hardened further into a mask of pure, glacial fury. If his uncle was hoarding weapons and grain in the abandoned eastern iron mines, it meant the treason went far deeper than stolen taxes or embezzled coin. It meant a civil war was already brewing in the shadows. Gideon turned away, his broad shoulders rising and falling with heavy, measured breaths as he stared into the hearth. The crackling fire illuminated the deep scars along his jaw, highlighting the savage alpha lurking just beneath his royal composure. The betrayal of his own blood was a bitter poison, but the realization that his people were being enslaved to forge his destruction ignited a wrath unlike any he had felt before. "We ride tonight," Gideon commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. He crossed the room to a heavy iron-bound chest, throwing it open to retrieve a magnificent, scarred broadsword. He buckled the leather harness across his chest with practiced, militaristic precision. He looked at Golda, the lethal fire in his amber eyes softening just a fraction as he took in her pale but resolute face. "You have done more for this kingdom in 2 days than my entire council has done in a year. Stay here. Bar the doors?" "No," Golda said firmly, stepping directly into his path. She did not flinch beneath his imposing height. "My brother, Arthur, was taken by Reginald's men under the guise of the northern conscription. If they are building an army in those mines, that is where Arthur is. I am going with you." Gideon studied her defiant posture, his gaze dropping to her trembling hands. He recognized the unyielding iron in her spine, the sheer desperation of a sister willing to walk into hell for her blood. Without another word of protest, he reached over to a heavy oak chair, retrieved a thick, dark riding cloak, and tossed it to her. Under the cover of a freezing, moonless night, the king and a small, elite contingent of his most loyal warriors rode out from the castle gates. Golda rode a swift gray mare, keeping pace just behind Gideon's massive black destrier. The journey toward the eastern ridge was a tense, silent blur of dark forests and biting wind. When the old iron mines finally loomed in the distance, they looked like a jagged, bleeding scar carved into the side of the mountain. Sputtering torches flickered at the entrance, revealing dozens of heavily armed mercenaries patrolling the perimeter, unaware of the storm descending upon them. Gideon did not bother with the strategy of stealth. He dismounted while his horse was still moving, shifting into his massive, midnight-furred wolf form before his boots even hit the dirt. He let out a blood-chilling roar that shook the very foundations of the mountain, a sound of absolute dominance that paralyzed the mercenary line. His warriors followed suit, a terrifying chorus of howls echoing into the night as they crashed into the enemy camp like a tidal wave of fangs and claws. Golda stayed mounted just long enough to ensure the entrance was breached, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. As the royal guard overpowered the outer defenses, she slipped from her saddle and sprinted past the carnage, diving into the damp, echoing darkness of the main cavern. Inside, the sheer, horrifying scale of Reginald's betrayal was laid bare. Thousands of sacks of winter grain, crates of newly forged weapons, and barrels of black powder lined the cavernous walls. But the true nightmare was the workforce. Hundreds of conscripted commoners, chained together by heavy iron links and starved to the bone, were being forced to haul heavy ore to blindingly hot furnaces. "Arthur!" Golda screamed, her voice tearing from her throat as she scrambled down the rough incline. She frantically scanned the sea of soot-stained, despairing faces. Arthur. She found him near the back wall, his clothes reduced to rags, his face bruised and covered in ash as he struggled to lift a heavy pickaxe. As she fell to her knees in the dirt and pulled his frail, exhausted body into a desperate, sobbing embrace, a slow, malicious clapping echoed through the cavern, cutting through the ambient noise of the mines. Lord Reginald stepped out from the shadows of an upper scaffolding, flanked by 5 massive, heavily scarred rogue alphas. "A touching family reunion," Reginald sneered, drawing a gleaming silver sword. His aristocratic features were twisted into a mask of arrogant triumph. "I anticipated you might discover this little operation, Gideon, but I did not think you would be foolish enough to walk directly into the trap." A heavy thud resonated from the cavern entrance. Gideon stepped into the light of the furnaces, having returned to his human form. His broadsword was drawn, its steel reflecting the fiery orange glow of the forge. He moved with a lethal, terrifying grace, stepping protectively in front of Golda and Arthur. "You have poisoned this pack from the inside out," Gideon growled, his voice carrying the full, crushing weight of his alpha aura. "You starve your own people. You enslave your own kind. I am securing our future," Reginald shouted back, his face flushing with manic desperation as he descended the wooden stairs. "You are weak, Gideon. You waste our resources on border skirmishes when we should be conquering the inner territories. Once I kill you, I will take the throne, and the Silver Mane will rule the entire continent. Hard karma comes for traitors, uncle," Gideon said softly, dropping his stance into a perfect, deadly guard. The battle that ensued was brutal, blindingly fast, and absolute. The 5 rogue alphas lunged simultaneously, but Gideon fought with the furious, unleashed power of a true sovereign defending his mate and his realm. He moved like a shadow, his blade a continuous arc of silver that effortlessly found the weak points in their defenses. Golda shielded Arthur with her own body, watching in awe as the king dismantled Reginald's finest killers one by one. Seeing his champions fall, Reginald's bravado shattered. He turned and attempted to flee, slipping toward a hidden, narrow tunnel at the back of the cavern. But he was intercepted. Not by Gideon, but by the very people he had broken and enslaved. Arthur, finding a sudden surge of strength, stood up. Alongside dozens of freed conscripts who had shattered their chains during the chaos, they wielded pickaxes, mining hammers, and heavy iron chains. They did not attack the traitorous lord. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder like an impenetrable wall of vengeance, forcing Reginald to stumble backward toward the center of the room. Gideon advanced, his amber eyes burning with relentless judgment. With a single, bone-shattering blow, he disarmed his uncle, kicking the older man's legs out from under him. Reginald collapsed heavily into the dirt, gasping for breath, the razor-sharp point of Gideon's broadsword resting intimately against his throat. "Mercy," Reginald choked out, his arrogance crumbling into pathetic, sobbing terror as he stared up at the nephew he had tried to destroy. "I am your blood. Gideon, you surrendered your right to my blood when you starved my people," Gideon replied, his voice echoing with absolute, cold authority. "You will not die tonight, Reginald. Death is too quick a release." The king's decree was swift and merciless. Right there on the cavern floor, Gideon invoked an ancient, dark pack ritual. He forced his dominating alpha aura into Reginald's mind, physically and spiritually severing his uncle's connection to the moon. Reginald screamed as his inner wolf was brutally stripped away, leaving him entirely human, weak, and broken. Stripped of his titles, his wealth, and his power, Reginald was condemned to spend the rest of his natural life working the very iron mines he had used to torture the innocent, under the watchful, unforgiving guard of the commoners he had despised. It was a flawless, agonizing retribution. Weeks later, the kingdom of Oakhaven finally began to heal. The stolen grain was distributed to the starving lower wards. The conscripts were returned to their grieving families, and the northern border was secured through clever diplomacy rather than needless bloodshed. Golda stood on the balcony of the royal gardens, no longer wearing faded hand-me-downs, but a stunning, meticulously tailored gown of deep crimson velvet. The autumn air was crisp, but she felt a familiar, scorching heat at her back, just before strong, muscular arms wrapped securely around her waist. "The council is still demanding a formal bonding ceremony," Gideon murmured, his breath warm as he pressed a tender kiss to the crook of her neck. "They seem to think our tavern arrangement was a bit informal." Golda leaned back into his solid chest, a genuine, radiant smile gracing her lips as she looked out over the peaceful city. "Let them wait. I kind of liked the tavern wall. It was honest. It was treason," Gideon corrected playfully, turning her in his arms so he could look down into her eyes. "But I suppose I can forgive it. You did save my kingdom." Golda turned a treasonous tavern message into a kingdom's salvation. By standing beside King Gideon, she destroyed Lord Reginald's treacherous regime and rescued her brother from the deadly mines. The brave apothecary proved that true strength lies not in claws, but in unwavering courage. Together, they rebuilt the broken pack from the shadows, proving that even the darkest secrets can ignite a reigning alpha's brightest and most enduring peaceful future.